Her name was Elena Marquez, though most who served beside her simply called her Mark. The name carried the same clipped precision as her presence, steady, reliable, and quietly commanding. She had been a medic in the army, and later, someone who carried memories heavier than the rucksack she once shouldered across deserts and mountains. To a passerby, she might have seemed like any other veteran, her uniform now traded for simple clothes, her hair tied back in a practical knot. But in her gaze lived both the shadows of wars fought abroad and the light of a woman who refused to let those shadows consume her. Elena had grown up near the California coast, where the salt air drifted endlessly and the horizon promised escape. She was 17 when she raised her right hand and swore her oath. She had no illusions of glory. She carried instead the simple determination to serve, to do something larger than herself. Her family had laughed nervously when she told them, "You? The quiet one," her older brother teased. But Elena's silence was never emptiness, it was resolve. In the early years, she learned how the rhythm of boots on gravel echoed in the chest like a second heartbeat. She learned how the desert sun could peel away more than skin. It stripped away illusions, leaving only grit and truth. Her hands became callous not from weapons but from binding wounds, from holding lives together with gauze, pressure, and whispered words of comfort. She was not the loudest in a room, but when chaos roared, her voice cut through, calm and steady, the way only those who had stared down fear could manage. Her tattoo came later. It wasn't elaborate, just lines, numbers, symbols inked in stark black against the pale of her forearm. Most never understood it. Some laughed when they first noticed it, mistaking it for random geometry or a cryptic puzzle. She never explained unless someone asked with true curiosity. To her, it wasn't decoration. It was remembrance. Each mark, each line, carried meaning only she could feel in her bones. A fallen comrade. A date etched into memory. A reminder of nights under foreign skies where she promised herself never to forget. At first, she kept it hidden beneath long sleeves. Not out of shame, never that, but out of reverence. Some things, she believed, were sacred in their quietness. Yet, over time, the tattoo became part of her story, just as scars do. One afternoon, while she was still in uniform, she pushed up her sleeve to adjust a strap, and the marks caught the attention of the men around her. They laughed. It wasn't cruel, more like the reflexive teasing soldiers threw at each other to hide discomfort. But laughter still stung, because they didn't know what it meant. They couldn't. Elena said nothing.
She didn't need to.
She only let her arm rest in the light, the black lines sharp against her skin, steady as her pulse. Later that same week, everything changed. The base had gathered for a routine ceremony, the kind that broke up the monotony of deployment, formal words, straight lines of uniforms, flags rippling against the wind. Elena stood near the back, her posture erect, but her mind drifting. Her sleeve had rolled back again in the heat, the tattoo visible under the unflinching sun. It was then that the SEAL commander stepped forward. A man carved from steel and salt water, his reputation preceded him, ruthless in combat, sharp in command. He had seen the tattoo. Instead of laughter, he paused. His eyes lingered, not with confusion, but with recognition. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand and gave her a salute. The air seemed to still. Conversations faltered. Boots rooted in place. The laughter from before dissolved into silence, replaced by the weight of an unspoken understanding. Elena felt heat rise to her face, not from shame, but from the sheer gravity of the moment. A salute, simple, sharp, formal, yet in it lived acknowledgement. It was a gesture that said, "I see you. I honor you. I know what those lines mean, even if no one else does." For Elena, it was not vindication. She had never sought to prove anything. It was instead a recognition of shared grief, of service, of sacrifice carried in ways no one outside the circle could ever fully grasp. Later, when she thought back to that day, Elena remembered less of the faces around her and more of the stillness that followed the salute. It was as if time itself had given her a moment of grace, a pause carved from chaos, where respect silenced ignorance. That night, as she lay in her bunk, she touched the ink gently, tracing each line with her fingertip. She let the memory of the commander's salute wash over her, not as triumph, but as quiet affirmation that her story mattered. Her tattoo was no longer something she carried alone. It had been seen, honored, understood, if only for a fleeting moment. And in that recognition, Elena felt something shift. A weight eased, not lifted entirely, but lightened enough that she could breathe more deeply. Enough that she could imagine tomorrow with a little less heaviness. For the first time in many months, she allowed herself to close her eyes without fear of dreams pulling her back into deserts and blood and silence. Instead, she dreamed of the ocean again, the same horizon that had once called her as a child. The waves whispered, steady and sure, like boots on gravel, like a second heartbeat. Elena Marquez slept, and for a while, she was at peace. The weeks after the commander's salute unfolded in a rhythm both familiar and strange. Outwardly, life on base carried on with its routines, drills, reports, the endless hum of machines, the shuffle of boots across gravel. But for Elena, something subtle had shifted. The salute had left her with a fragile ember of recognition, and yet it also deepened the awareness of how invisible much of her burden remained. By day, she worked as always, wrapping wounds, monitoring vitals, offering steady words to men twice her size who flinched at the sight of needles. She became a quiet pillar in the medic tent, her calm presence a balm when the air grew thick with pain and panic. But by night, the silence pressed harder. She would lie awake, staring at the corrugated ceiling, listening to the desert wind drag sand across the canvas walls. In that quiet, memories returned with brutal clarity. The choking dust after an IED blast, the weight of blood-soaked uniforms in her hands, the soft, unsteady breaths of soldiers fighting to stay alive. There was one face she could never erase. Private Lawson. Barely 19, his freckles still childlike under the grime of war. She remembered the day too well. The scorching heat, the metallic taste of dust, the call that tore through the radio. She remembered sprinting across uneven ground, her kit banging against her ribs. When she reached him, the injury was already beyond saving. She had pressed down, whispered reassurances, lied with kindness. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." He had looked at her with wide, pleading eyes, and for a moment, she believed her own words. But the light faded faster than she could push the blood back into his veins. She carried him back herself. Others offered, but she had refused. She bore his weight in her arms, every step etching itself into her muscles, her mind, her heart. Later, when the base was quiet, she etched his initials into her skin, one of the lines on her forearm. The tattoo that others mocked was not decoration. It was Lawson. It was his memory carved into her flesh, so that forgetting was never an option. But grief was not her only struggle. Returning home on leave, Elena found herself in a world that had moved forward without her. Streets bustled with laughter that felt too loud, conversations at family dinners skimmed across surfaces too thin to hold her truths. She smiled when expected, nodded when spoken to, but her heart carried a silence others mistook for distance. "You're so serious now," her sister once said, half joking. Elena forced a laugh, but inside, her chest ached. The hardest moments were in crowds. The sudden crack of fireworks during a holiday celebration sent her heart racing, her body instinctively crouching low. Strangers stared, confused, some amused. Elena would steady herself quickly, but the shame lingered. She hated the way her body betrayed her, pulling her back into deserts she had left behind. Even among fellow veterans, she felt both belonging and isolation. They swapped stories over cheap beers, trading gallows humor like currency. Elena listened, sometimes joined, but more often fell silent. For her, the memories weren't stories. They were wounds still open, raw to the touch. She didn't want to laugh them off. She wanted to honor them. It was during one of these evenings, gathered in a dimly lit bar near base, that someone pointed at her tattoo again. Still carrying that scribble mark? the soldier teased, slurring his words. The others chuckled. Elena met his eyes, her own steady and unflinching. She didn't rise to the bait.
She didn't need to.
Another voice cut in, a quiet but firm correction. It means something, one of the older veterans said, his gaze steady. The room fell into a brief hush before conversation shifted elsewhere. Elena exhaled slowly, grateful but weary. Recognition was rare, fleeting, often spoken only in moments like that, by those who knew what it meant to carry ghosts. As months stretched on, her struggle deepened into something less visible but heavier, the weight of meaning. What had all of it been for? The sleepless nights, the loss, the scars etched on her arm and in her soul? She found herself pacing in the early hours, her boots tapping softly against the wooden floors of her small apartment. The sound reminded her of marching, of order, of purpose. Yet here, in civilian life, the rhythm echoed into emptiness. Still, she did not break. In the mornings, she rose with discipline, her bed made tight, her boots aligned neatly by the door. Routine was her shield, her way of refusing surrender to the void. She volunteered at a clinic, tending to patients who never asked about her past. Sometimes, she would catch her reflection in the window, shoulders squared, eyes tired but unyielding, and she would think, I am still here.
That has to count for something.
One evening, as twilight bled across the horizon, Elena sat on her porch with a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. The neighborhood children played down the street, their laughter echoing with the carefree ease of lives untouched by war. She watched, quiet, her heart caught between longing and relief. She lifted her sleeve, tracing the ink on her arm. Each line was a weight, yes, but also a tether, a reminder that her story was not erased by silence or misunderstanding. The world might not always know how to see her, but the tattoo spoke for her, even when words failed. And as the stars began to pierce the night sky, Elena whispered a promise to herself, that she would not let her struggles harden her into bitterness, that she would carry them with grace, with quiet strength, that somehow, in the cracks left by loss, she would still find light. Rain came softly that morning, a thin veil misting over the streets as Elena walked toward the Veteran Center. The building was plain brick, unremarkable from the outside, but inside it carried the weight of stories like hers, fragmented, heavy, and searching for places to land. She had resisted coming here for weeks, unsure if sitting in a circle of strangers could ease the ache she carried. But something in her had shifted. Perhaps it was the quiet promise she'd made to herself on her porch, or perhaps it was the weight of nights spent pacing, unable to find rest. The hall smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. Folding chairs formed a circle, and already a handful of men and women sat scattered, their expressions guarded but softened by the familiarity of shared struggle. Elena slipped into a chair near the edge, her posture upright, her sleeve tugged instinctively low. The facilitator, a woman with gray hair tucked neatly into a bun, opened the meeting with a voice both gentle and firm. We're here to carry together what is too heavy alone. The words settled in Elena's chest like a stone dropped in still water, rippling outward. She listened as others spoke, a Marine describing his first 4th of July back home, how the fireworks cracked open something he thought he had buried, a woman pilot recalling the silence of empty barracks after her crew never returned. Their voices wove a fabric of loss and resilience, each thread fragile but binding. When the circle turned to her, Elena hesitated. Her throat felt tight, her hands restless in her lap. For a moment she thought of staying silent, of letting the space pass. But then she lifted her sleeve, revealing the black lines etched into her skin. The room grew still. This is how I remember, she said quietly. Her voice carried no bravado, only steady truth. Each mark is a name.
A date.
Someone I promised not to forget. She traced one line gently with her fingertip. They laughed at it once, said it was just scribbles. But for me, it's the only way I know how to carry them with me. Her words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of honesty. No one laughed. No one dismissed. Instead, A silence filled the room, respectful, heavy, affirming. One of the older veterans, his hands scarred and rough, gave a slow nod. "That's not ink," he murmured. "That's memory." In that moment, Elena felt something loosen inside her, like a knot she had carried too long. To be seen without needing to explain, to have her grief honored instead of mocked, it was more than she had expected. It was more than she had allowed herself to hope for. Weeks turned into months, and she returned to the circle often. Each meeting layered her with a little more strength, a little more ease in carrying what once felt unbearable. She still had nights when the desert came roaring back in her dreams, still had moments when crowds made her chest tighten, but she no longer faced them alone. There were others now, voices she could call, shoulders she could lean against. It was during this time that she was invited to speak at a small memorial event at the base. The request unsettled her at first. Public speaking was far from her comfort, and the thought of exposing her inner scars to an audience of strangers made her palms sweat. Yet something urged her forward, the sense that perhaps her story, raw and imperfect, might offer someone else a fragment of solace. The day of the event dawned clear, the sky sharp blue against the crisp folds of flags lining the field. Rows of uniforms stood in quiet attention, families gathered with photographs of loved ones pressed to their chests. Elena stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding with the rhythm of boots on gravel. She began slowly, her voice steady but soft. She spoke not of battles won or medals earned, but of faces remembered, of the weight of loss carried home in silence. She rolled up her sleeve, letting the sunlight catch the dark ink on her arm. "These are not just lines," she said, holding her arm out for all to see. "They are names, stories, promises. They are the ones who cannot stand here today, but through me, they are not forgotten." The crowd shifted, breaths catching, eyes glistening. She felt their attention not as scrutiny, but as shared reverence. And then, from the front row, the SEAL commander who once saluted her rose slowly to his feet. His hand came up in a sharp, deliberate salute. The air thickened with stillness. One by one, others followed, soldiers, veterans, civilians alike, standing in unison, their hands raised in solemn respect. Elena's throat tightened, her vision blurred with sudden tears. It was not about her. It had never been. It was about them. The fallen, the remembered, the etched lines carried in her skin. In that wave of salutes, she felt her struggle transform into something larger. No longer a private grief hidden under sleeves, but a shared acknowledgement, a collective vow that those lost lives mattered. When the ceremony ended, Elena stepped down from the podium, her chest lighter than it had been in years. The tattoo on her arm no longer felt like a burden, it felt like a bridge. A way to connect memory with meaning, sorrow with strength. That night, as she sat quietly in her apartment, the rain tapping softly at the window, Elena allowed herself a long, deep breath. She closed her eyes, let the stillness settle, and whispered the names etched on her arm one by one. Not as laments, but as blessings. For the first time, she did not feel haunted. She felt accompanied. Morning sunlight spilled across Elena's kitchen table, golden and soft, warming the wood where her hands rested. A steaming cup of coffee sent threads of steam curling upward, and she breathed it in slowly, letting the simple ritual anchor her. Outside, the neighborhood stirred awake. Children's laughter rang faintly from a school bus stop, and a dog barked twice before quieting. Life went on in its ordinary rhythm, but for Elena, each sound carried a deeper resonance now. She no longer felt like a ghost drifting through it all. She was present, rooted, alive. Months had passed since the memorial, and still the memory of salutes rising in unison returned to her often. Not as a sharp pang, but as a steady warmth she carried into her days. That moment had not erased her grief, but it had reshaped it, softening its edges, giving it a form she could bear. She no longer felt the need to hide the tattoo under long sleeves. It was simply part of her now, visible as any other truth. Sometimes strangers noticed it, their eyes flickering with curiosity, but their silence never unsettled her. She had made peace with what it meant, and what it didn't need to explain. She found herself giving back in quiet ways. At the clinic, she lingered a little longer with patients, listening not only to symptoms but to silences between their words. On weekends, she volunteered at the Veteran Center, helping new arrivals find their footing. She remembered the unease she once carried walking into that room for the first time, and she met others now with a gentleness that said, "You don't have to carry this alone." One evening, after a group session, a young soldier approached her. His hands fidgeted, his eyes restless, darting toward the floor. He gestured toward her arm, then stopped himself, unsure if he should ask. Elena offered a small smile, pulling her sleeve back without hesitation. "Each line is someone I remember," she explained softly. He stared for a long moment, then nodded, his shoulders loosening just slightly. He didn't speak further, but she recognized the unspoken gratitude in his eyes, the comfort of seeing that grief could be carried, that survival did not mean forgetting. At home, her nights were calmer now. Dreams still visited, but they no longer tore her from sleep gasping. Instead, when memories surfaced, she let them unfold. Sometimes she saw Lawson's face, freckles faint in desert light, but instead of breaking her, it grounded her. She whispered his name like a prayer, trusting that memory itself was an act of keeping alive. Elena began to write. At first, only small notes in the margins of a worn journal, fragments of memory, half-finished sentences, the names of those she carried etched now not only in ink on her skin but also in words on a page. Over time, the fragments grew into longer passages. She did not write for publication, nor for recognition. She wrote because the act of placing memory into language felt like weaving order from chaos, like stitching torn cloth. She wrote so that when her hands grew old and her voice unsteady, the stories would remain. One late afternoon, she walked along the shoreline near her childhood home, the ocean stretching vast and endless before her. The same horizon she once gazed at as a girl, dreaming of escape, now greeted her with a different promise, not of leaving but of returning. Waves crashed steadily, the salt air clung to her skin, and the gulls wheeled above with cries that pierced the wind. She closed her eyes and listened, letting the rhythm of the sea echo against the steady rhythm of her heart. Her reflection surfaced gently, not forced but natural, like tide meeting sand. She thought of the young woman who left at 17, brimming with quiet resolve. She thought of the desert sun, of Lawson's last breath, of the salute that had stilled a field of soldiers into silence. She thought of laughter that once mocked and how it no longer wounded her. Each memory, each scar, each line of ink, they were all strands of the same thread, weaving her into the woman she was now. She paused, lifting her arm, the tattoo stark and dark against the soft glow of dusk. For years she had seen it as weight, as burden. Now, she saw it as map, each line leading her not backward into pain, but forward into meaning. It was not just memory, it was testament. As the sun dipped low, painting the water with streaks of fire and gold, Elena whispered aloud, her voice carried by the wind. "You're not forgotten. None of you ever will be." The words dissolved into the sea air, but in her chest they remained. A vow renewed, steady as the horizon before her. That night, she returned home and sat by her window, the stars bright above, the city quiet below. She did not feel the need to plan every step ahead. For once, it was enough to simply be, to sit with memory and hope side by side, neither erasing the other. Her journey had not ended, it never would, but it had transformed. She was no longer defined by wounds alone. She was defined by the grace with which she carried them, by the light she let in through the cracks, by the quiet strength behind her smile. And so Elena Marquez stood, not only as a veteran, not only as a woman who endured, but as a keeper of stories, a bearer of memory, and a beacon of hope for others finding their way through silence. The first snow of the season fell in small, deliberate flakes, drifting slowly past Elena's window. She stood at the glass, a mug of tea warming her palms, watching as the world softened under white. There was something almost sacred in that silence, how the snow absorbed the city's noise, how even the most jagged corners of the streets looked gentler beneath its veil. For Elena, it was a reminder that time carried its own rhythms, and healing, like snowfall, came layer by layer, quiet and unhurried. Her life had settled into a new kind of steadiness. Mornings were filled with her work at the clinic, afternoons often at the Veterans Center, evenings writing at the worn oak desk she had inherited from her grandmother. Yet beneath the simplicity of her routines was a current of change. She had begun to feel that her story, once something she carried privately, almost protectively, was meant to be shared. Not as an act of confession, but as an offering. One evening, the director of the center approached her with a question. "Would you speak at the winter gathering?" His voice was careful, as though he knew the weight of what he was asking. Elena hesitated, her fingers brushing instinctively over her forearm, over the tattoo that had always spoken more than she did. But after a pause, she nodded. The night of the gathering arrived. A modest hall was filled with folding chairs and warm light, the smell of coffee mingling with cinnamon rolls donated by a local bakery. Veterans sat shoulder to shoulder, some with families, some alone. There was a hum of quiet conversations, the kind that held both comfort and unspoken ache. When Elena's name was called, she rose, her heart steady but her breath shallow, the way it always was before stepping into something unknown. She walked to the podium, the room settling into silence. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking in the sight of faces, faces marked by experience, by survival, by longing to belong. She didn't open with a speech she had rehearsed. Instead, she let the truth find its own path. "I used to believe that silence was strength," she began, her voice calm but low, compelling the room to lean closer. "That if I buried the weight deep enough, no one would see the cracks. But silence, I learned, isn't the same as strength. Silence can be a cage. And cages, they only hold us until we decide to step out." She lifted her arm, pulling back her sleeve to reveal the tattoo. A murmur rippled through the audience, not of shock, but of recognition. "Each line," she continued, "is someone I carry. I thought marking their names would keep them close. And it does. But what I didn't understand then was that memory lives most fully when shared. We honor them by speaking their names, by living with a courage they'd be proud of." Her voice caught slightly, and she let the pause stretch, unashamed of the quiver in her tone. "If you carry something heavy, know this. You don't have to carry it alone. There is no weakness in reaching out a hand. Sometimes survival means letting someone else hold the weight with you, even just for a moment." The hall was quiet when she finished, not with discomfort but with reverence. Then came the applause, gentle at first, then swelling, not thunderous but steady, like rain on a roof. She stepped down from the podium, her hands trembling, but for the first time in years, the trembling wasn't from fear. It was release. Later, as people lingered, a young woman approached her. She was barely 20, her uniform jacket a little too big on her frame, her eyes shadowed but searching. "I didn't think anyone would understand," she whispered. Elena placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and warm. "I do," she said simply. And in that moment, she saw the flame passing forward, the small but vital light of recognition, of connection, of shared survival. That night, back home, Elena sat by the window again, the snow still falling outside, stars faint above the clouds. She opened her journal and wrote, not just for herself, but for those who might one day read it. Her words stretched across the page like bridges, reaching out into the silence where so many still lingered. She wrote with the hope that they would find those words and feel less alone. When she finally set her pen down, she closed the book with a quiet exhale. Her eyes drifted back to the snow outside, blanketing the streets in stillness. She thought of Lawson, of the others, of the voices that once filled her days. They were gone, yet never absent. She felt them there, in the hush of the night, in the warmth of the applause, in the eyes of the young soldier who found her after the speech. Elena pressed her palm against the glass, the cold seeping into her skin, grounding her. Life was fragile, yes, but it was also resilient. And as long as breath filled her lungs, she would keep telling the stories, keep carrying the light forward. Not as burden, but as gift. The snow continued to fall, each flake a quiet miracle, each one unique, yet together forming something vast and beautiful. And beneath that quiet sky, Elena knew, the world still needed her voice. The evening air carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke as Elena walked along the narrow path that wound behind the Veterans Center. Lanterns had been strung between the trees for the winter festival, their golden light swaying gently in the cold breeze. Children's laughter drifted through the night, mingling with the muffled notes of a guitar someone strummed near the bonfire. Elena moved slowly, her boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Though the world around her hummed with warmth and community, her thoughts turned inward, drawn back to the faces she had spoken of at the gathering weeks before. Their names still lingered on her lips when she woke in the night, but now, instead of bringing only ache, they carried something else: presence. It felt as though, by saying them aloud, she had given them room to live again in the hearts of others. A cluster of young veterans sat near the edge of the firelight, their shoulders hunched, their laughter brittle. Elena recognized the look in their eyes, the same mix of distance and tension she once wore like armor. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Mind if I sit?" she asked gently. They nodded, shifting to make space on the log. The warmth of the fire reached her face, and for a long moment, no one spoke. She let the silence breathe, understanding that it often needed to settle before words could rise. Finally, one of the men broke it. "It doesn't feel real," he murmured, staring into the flames. "Being back. Everyone keeps saying I should be happy to be home, but I don't feel it here." Elena turned her gaze to the fire, the crackle of burning wood filling the pause. "I know that feeling," she said quietly. "Like your body returned, but parts of you are still out there. It's disorienting. Sometimes it feels like walking through a world made of glass, always afraid it might shatter." The young man looked at her then, his jaw tight, but his eyes softer. Another soldier nodded in agreement, their faces lit in flickers of orange and gold. They didn't speak further, but they didn't need to. The recognition in their silence was enough. Later that night, as the festival wound down, Elena slipped away toward the chapel on the hill, a small wooden structure with peeling paint and a bell that hadn't rung in years. Inside, the air was cool, tinged with the scent of old wood and candle wax. She sat in the last pew, letting the stillness settle over her like a blanket. Here, she allowed herself to release what she often kept tucked away. Memories pressed forward, the sudden crack of gunfire in distant deserts, the weight of loss that followed in silence, the night terrors that left her gasping. Yet woven among them now were newer threads: the applause at the gathering, the hand of the young woman on her shoulder, the small group by the fire. Pain and healing lived side by side, neither erasing the other. Her eyes drifted upward, tracing the wooden beams of the ceiling. For the first time in years, she whispered a prayer. Not for herself, but for those still searching for ground to stand on, for those still burdened by silence. When she rose to leave, she noticed a notebook tucked into the corner of the pew. Curious, she opened it. The first page was filled with handwriting, uneven, hurried. It was a journal where visitors left anonymous entries. She read fragments. "I don't know how to let go. Today I almost gave up. I just needed to write this somewhere." Elena held the book against her chest, feeling the echo of voices too heavy for their owners to carry alone. Gently, she reached for the pen that rested beside it. Her words came slowly, deliberate. "You are not alone. Pain can convince us we are isolated, but we are bound together more deeply than we know. Hold on. Your strength is not measured by silence, but by the courage to endure." She set the notebook back, smoothing her hand over the worn cover. In that quiet chapel, with its faded wood and its chorus of unseen voices, she felt part of something larger, an unseen thread connecting her to strangers she might never meet, yet understood deeply. Walking back down the hill, she pulled her coat tighter against the wind. The stars above were faint but steady, scattered like small promises across the dark sky. Each step felt grounded, each breath more intentional. At home, she lit a single candle on her windowsill, letting its glow soften the room. She didn't write that night, nor did she retreat into silence. Instead, she simply sat with the flame, watching it flicker against the glass. In that quiet space, she realized something. Healing wasn't a finish line. It was a rhythm, like breath, like the tide, like the snowfall she had watched weeks before. There would always be echoes of the past, but they no longer drowned her. They were voices she could carry with grace, voices that reminded her of what it meant to endure, to connect, to live. And as the candle burned low, Elena closed her eyes, her heart steady. She knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new chances to listen, to speak, to be present. And for her, that was enough.